So welcome everyone to the discussion of MANA leadership. My name is Lisa Sandhusen. I'm in New Jersey. I am a former postpartum doula. I name myself as a birth keeper and advocate for birth choices. So I will be your facilitator of this discussion today. And I'm going to outline for us a couple of housekeeping engagement conventions. So I have the chat open, but the chat is open only so that everyone can see what I muted myself accidentally. So the invitation is to share your questions here in the chat. We are going to go through, we have an agenda organized. So some of the topics we're going to cover are why we're here, how to build some trust. We're going to look at the history of the MANA organization. We're going to look at some of the what it takes to organize an organization and a group, and how it goes through its.
It's not seen.
Oh, if I can ask people to mute kindly, because we can hear background conversation and we are recording. All right, so we're going to also find out what some of the what to do after. We're going to find out what are some of the things that are happening with policies and procedures. We're going to be talking about need for leadership training and development. And then we're going to look at resolution and see, like, there are some things that need to be discussed. And so basically the whole outline, the overarching view here is to have some curiosity and learning about what has happened. We're going to honor our past, our present, and our future. So we're going to be having some of those. So hopefully all of your questions will get answered. And off we go. So who's here? So we have Deb Putterbaugh, who has organized this, and she's been a midwife since 1977 in Alaska and since 1985 in California. So she is a founding member of MAA, Midwives Association of Alaska, and was a contact person for Mothering Mag State on Midwifery magazine, published in 1980. So she's also been contributing to the founding meetings of MANA as a regional rep for Alaska. So she was a vocal member of the resistance to labeling direct entry midwives, non-nurse midwives, and helped with first attempts at regulation in both Alaska and California. So she's a retired CPM, still licensed in California, and today she teaches and writes about the profession of midwifery. And Deb is inspired by the decision of UNESCO to identify midwifery as an intangible cultural heritage, and supports the acknowledgement of ICM, International Confederacy of Midwives, giving Indigenous midwives the right to educate their own. She feels deeply that we need to define ourselves and our scope of practice outside obstetrics. And today she lives in Baja California and works to improve maternal child health care. So thank you, Deb, for being here and convening this conversation. I'm going to go through and introduce for people who are joining. I'm going to continue with the introductions. I'm going to admit there are a couple more people ready to come in. And Sarita Bennett has served MANA as a volunteer board member for 10 years, and serving first as secretary, then vice president, and finally president. So she was removed from the presidency in 2021, a result of social media defamation campaign. And Sarita practiced as an illegal traditional midwife before becoming an osteopathic family physician, and is currently, sorry, my tongue is going faster than my brain, retired after 40 years plus from active practice. And also joining our conversation is Deanne Graham, a scholar of the social history of medicine with a focus on midwifery. So as the vice president of the Foundation for the Advancement of Midwifery, she helped uncover and document the improprieties of FAM, MANA, and NARM. So we're going to be looking through the histories. We're going to be let's see, and examining the places that the organization pivoted from its original mission and vision. We're going to be curious and asking questions, and we're going to not really have a solution, but maybe we'll answer some questions, bring some things to light so that people can have a more insightful and thoughtful conversation moving forward. How does that all sound so far? Seeing some nods. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone who has joined us. The chat is open and the invitation is for people to share where they're from. And I'm going to pass the microphone on to Sarita. To Deb, are you going to take this next?
I'll just take a minute to
Yep.
say why we pulled this together. So historically, I've been involved with MANA from the beginning, always usually in a more grassroots way, more local way, not so much in national support. But historically, I just think it's important to sort of contextualize why we're meeting here and why it's important that Sarita have an opportunity to speak. As many of you know, MANA has been it has ended. There was a decision in the board to close the organization down. This was not done in a consensus fashion. But when I got pulled into this conversation was about 4 years ago, when I was just strolling my social media, and I saw a comment from Liz Moore in Virginia. And she said, you know, something about what was going on in Virginia. And I said, well, have you taken this to peer review? And she said, I don't know what land you live in, but there is no peer review here. And that woke me up and got my attention with the situation. I then started to find out more about what was going on, which ultimately culminated in a tragic public display of lack of professionalism within our organization and the ousting of Sarita from her presidency. It was very hard to watch, and I became involved with that. And now I feel that connecting the dots from that experience led to this ultimate demise. And so that's why I got involved in the beginning when they wanted to do some kind of memorial for MANA. I think that a memorial is appropriate, but I also feel that before we can have a wake and just talk about all the wonderful things that MANA has done, because there are many, that we need to talk about what caused MANA to implode, and hopefully that we can learn from that. And I know that it is Sarita's intention not to get into the minutia and details of personalities and those sorts of things, but to really look at what systemically, what institutionally went wrong, and why we were not able to resolve our conflicts within the organization and ultimately see it carry on. So that was my intention to pull this together. And I want to thank Lisa Sanderson from the bottom of my heart. She is the most amazing mediator. I've called upon her several times to help mediate conflict. And also, she just stepped into my shoes when my mother was dying and emceed the second Birthkeeper Summit in Washington, D.C., and did an amazing job. So Lisa, hand it over to you. Thank you so much for facilitating this day. And I want to thank everybody for being here. And we are recording this, and there are many other people who were interested who will have follow-up, a way for you to, communicate afterwards. So I'm going to mute myself, and Lisa.
All right, thank you, Deb. Just so everyone understands too, we'll say this at the beginning of the meeting because some people may need to leave, is that this meeting is being recorded and will be available for people to listen to. And there will be also an opportunity for people to send questions. And Deb, can you say where that's going to be? Do you know where that's going to be? You're on mute. You need to unmute. Deb, can you unmute? Let's see. You're muted, Deb. Deb, yeah.
Sorry.
Yep.
You got me? Okay, so we set up a Facebook page, which is where we posted this information, and we'll use that as a hub to continue the dialogue after this.
All right, so for those that are watching the recording, there is going to be an opportunity to ask questions. So because we are working with collaborative decision-making and nonviolent communication, just want to remind everyone that the chat is open and to use that respectfully and use nonviolent communication language. So this meeting, what it's not a place to blame. This is about learning and excavating so that we can move forward collectively with information. And with that, I'm going to pass the microphone on to Sarita.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa and Deb and everybody that's here today. I don't know how many of you have read the blog that I recently released about my experience in the 10 years I was in MANA leadership from 2011 to 2021. But that gives you some basis of understanding some of the topics that were important to me and that I'm particularly interested in answering questions about. I will, in answering the question of why we're here today, I'll reiterate what Lisa said, that this is really about building trust. And in my experience, the only way we can build trust is to have transparency. Transparency then requires that people have the ability to question, to ask questions, to be curious, as Lisa said so well, and not feel that their voices are silenced. Anytime I saw, a lack of transparency or voices being silenced, I always had to continue to answer the question or ask the question why. I often asked myself why I was on the MANA board during those 10 years, because I hadn't been part of MANA before. Before that, I'd been much more active in my own state and my local area, and it wasn't something that had ever interested me. And when I was nominated, just like when I answered the call to midwifery, I felt this call to move into this position. I learned pretty quickly that as you reach your potential and you become more empowerment, that it begins to injure relationships. And that's something I'm going to talk about later when we talk about trauma, about how easy it is for us, especially in I'll just say a patriarchal power dynamic. It's so easy for female power relationships to become dysfunctional. And I think that when we move towards becoming our whole selves, like when I first went to medical school, or when I became went on the MANA board at all, or when I stepped into the presidency, all along the way, I lost relationships with people that I thought had been my friends. And I think that we need to look at how we treat each other in those as we reach our pathways. What I want to really talk about, though, here is that I think I was there so that I could witness this, and so that I could be a documentarian and a historian and try to bridge the demise and learn what we can from it in terms of system breakdowns so that any future organization can be much more sustainable and not have the same kinds of traumatic endings. What my questions really have been around and have been the pivot points of, and I'm sure everybody has their opinion, and I would like to hear those, of when key decisions that were made that shifted this organization that had been such a grassroots representative organization into one that really not very many people knew what was going on, you know, for the last couple years. I'm not sure that we've known anything that was going on. So it went from serving a community to, you know, serving perhaps the voice of just a few people. It went from being a representative organization to joining into a more modern look of a skills-based board that was really kind of set on trying to keep up with national politics as a #1 priority, which meant that we many times went from prioritizing birth autonomy as the top priority to prioritizing a very limited definition of what a midwife was, and that always involved a credential or meeting the ICM definition. So it made it very easy for us to leave behind, with each of these pivot points, it made it easy to leave behind the original mission and vision of being a voice for the midwifery profession and for all midwives, regardless of their pathway of education or their legal status, to becoming part of what I often refer to as an alphabet soup of organizations that really seem to be much more about fitting midwifery into the medical industrial complex in a way that demanded compromise and that not all midwives were willing to make. So I think we're here really to look at those pivot points, to look at what the system breakdowns may have been, to be honest with ourselves, to be vulnerable. I'm willing to be very vulnerable about what my experience was and how it affected me personally. And to really look at the simple fact that we don't all have to like each other, but we certainly have to stop traumatizing each other. And, you know, we have to learn to walk together. So that's my answer to the question of why we're here. I don't know if anybody had any particular questions about any of the topics in my blog in terms of ICM, how that worked, US MARA, how that worked, MANA stats, how that worked, although we can talk more about MANA stats as we talk about the future. But I'm more than happy to entertain any of those questions, and Lisa will help me field those.
Yes, people can place their questions in the chat box at any time. Great, thanks. So do you want to start with the importance of organizational structure?
I will.
Yeah.
Because that's really what I learned a huge amount. Being on the MANA board was an incredible experience of learning, you know, what leadership really means. And I got the opportunity to be exposed to other amazing leaders, to watch people work together, and to learn more and more about how we got to where we are. I, like Deb, even though I wasn't part of MANA at the beginning, I was certainly part of the midwifery movement and, you know, doing the same things in my state. And when I look back, I see 3 things that, whether we want to admit it or not, were at the foundation of building this organization. And I know the stories. There's a story from my friend Ruth Walsh that I mentioned in my blog about a meeting, I believe it was in Minnesota, where they were trying to come up with wording, and there was a lot of, as you can imagine, wordsmithing going on. I can't remember whether it was it was an exact wording that everybody wanted to agree upon. And she talked a lot about how everybody was always locking the doors and wondering who they were afraid of, who they thought was going to try to get in, and why they felt the need to lock the doors. So I think that reflects that at the beginning, so many of us were practicing illegally that we didn't feel safe. And so we brought our trauma responses of not feeling safe with us into creating this organization and this movement. I think we also had a lot of imposter syndrome because we hadn't gone to any type of academic institution. We had learned experientially. And I see even today midwives talking about that all the time, of not feeling like you really were what you were. And because of both of those things, I believe that what we began to do fairly early on was seek external validation. And that always begins to weaken your power stance, because you're giving your power to the people that you're asking to validate you. And that's very typical in a patriarchal culture. So what I saw, so I think that seed was there from the very beginning, even though amazing work was done in the early years. And, you know, I was peripherally involved in that. That what wound up happening in the 10 years that I saw the changes happen is that, and what I think needs, the system breakdowns I saw, rather than identifying it in a negative way, I'm going to talk about what a healthy organization needs to move towards. And the first one really is understanding your bylaws and how important they are as the constitution of the organization. Not being in compliance with the bylaws was something that began to happen regularly, both in terms of people holding dual positions, which was against bylaws very explicitly, or the lack of having any annual business meetings with financial reports, especially in the last couple of years. As a membership organization, there was a bylaw obligation to communicate with the members, and I personally am unaware of any of that happening right up until the letter that outlined the demise. In a healthy organization, the membership would have been a part of that decision-making and would have been consulted in terms of how to dissolve and how to move forward. Another huge need that I see is that before people join a national board, or upon their joining a national board at this level, there really needs to be leadership training as a first step in onboarding into the organization. That really fell to the wayside. And leadership training before or at the time of your arrival, with regular leadership development training maintained. Many of us were leaders before we got there, but it didn't mean that we were ready to be a leadership team at that level with that kind of decision-making ability. So part of that leadership training, if we're going to have an organization anywhere in the future that's non-hierarchical, has to be a deep understanding of consensus decision-making, which requires huge amounts of energy to figure out how to do it well so that it's not painful. Because I've done it and it's painful, and I've done it and it's brilliant. And so that alone can make a huge difference in the power dynamics of any healthy organization, and needs to be ongoing and practiced in a way that really does create equity of access to the decision-making power. It's one of those things that's necessary for a socially just organization. A key, and if anybody knows Renata Hillman, who was secretary that resigned when I was removed from office, she'll talk to you. I was hoping she'd be here today, and she was brilliant at understanding that updating policies and procedures and having very clear, healthy boundaries for how the organization works, how communication works, how interpersonal relationships work, it was missing. They hadn't been updated for a long time. Moving into the age of electronic communication was one of the variables that contributed to that, because it's very different going from, snail mail to electronic communication. And the old policies and procedures were, redundant and lots of pages, and they were difficult to update, and we were constantly trying to get that done. Renata probably was more successful about that than anybody. And I personally think that one of the reasons they were hard to change is that MANA we all had this image, right? We had this image of Manna as this big thing, because it was, and as this sort of great mother, if you want to use that analogy. And so when you came on the board, it was really scary to think about changing things, even though we all desperately knew they needed to be changed, because nobody wanted to touch anything. There was too much history. That's why I could say there was a bit of a founders syndrome, because there was so much history and nobody wanted to change anything, that the need to change then kind of created this system breakdown. So let's see what else. Policies and procedures, leadership development, bylaw compliance, and really understanding the obligations of what a nonprofit is, and the simple reality that the people in the organization the board doesn't own those assets. The board doesn't own that organization. That organization really is owned by the community, by the public, which is why I believe, even though we often had people who didn't have memberships, hadn't paid to be part of the organization, who felt ownership of the organization and now feel its demise in a way that's personal, even though they weren't necessarily involved in the leadership. Yeah, and I think it's just important to understand that that this organizational structure breakdown didn't happen overnight. These kinds of things get chipped away little by little as different leadership styles show up, as different relationships are made, as different priorities change. And the more it's chipped away and the more fluid the decision-making becomes, the more vulnerable the organization is to losing its ability to be socially just by being transparent, by having equal access to the power of decision-making, and to have protocols that apply to everyone equally. And that chipping away is like that frog in boiling water, that suddenly, the frog realized how dangerous the habitat was, and it was too late. And I believe that was a lot of what happened to Manna.
Thanks, Sarita. Can you share more about the nonprofit and moving into the assets and what that means? Like,
Sure.
give us a little bit of background about what's there, what's happening.
Sure. I've been involved in nonprofits quite a bit through the years, from food co-ops to state organizations to my own training programs. I have the fortune of having a brother who is, believe it or not, an incredibly honest attorney, and has been since 1970, and always makes sure we were taught by our mother to make sure everybody's treated equally, and not to try to get whatever we could get, but to make sure that, like, we lived by the standard of how you treated others was what kind of person you were. And so he's an IRS tax code specialist, and he's helped me a lot through the years of understanding these IRS tax codes and legally how you have to do these things. And the understanding that the assets that belong to a nonprofit belong to a community. Now, Manna was a 501c6, which is a professional organization, and so their assets technically belong to the membership. Although, like, as I said, the community claims ownership of the organization regardless of membership status. So we could think of it, especially Manna Stats, as belonging to the community, because that's who it was for. There are steps by law that have to be followed when a nonprofit organization dissolves. It should have been in the bylaws. I'm sure it was, because that's part of having bylaws. You have to list out the steps of what you're going to do with the assets when the nonprofit organization no longer exists. And my understanding is that they need to be given or transferred to another nonprofit with a similar mission. When we talk about FAM, Foundation for Advancement of Midwifery, that's also a nonprofit, but that's a 501c3, which is a different tax status. And so that was created because if there were people that wanted to give donations to MANA, they weren't tax deductible being given to a 501c6 in the same way that they were when they were given to a 501c3. So the legal relationship was created to that MANA was the sole member of FAM, which meant that MANA had the right, the MANA board or MANA had the right to nominate, appoint, and remove FAM's board members. And they had the right through the Connecticut statutes to access, for rights of transparency, any of the financial documents or minutes. And FAM had no obligation to give any money to MANA. And as I said, they were very different nonprofit statuses. So how that money was supposed to be handled had very different tax codes that had to be followed. So those are the kinds of things when you get into nonprofits, is understanding these aren't your assets. These are the community's assets. These are the membership's assets. This money belongs to the public, not to the board. So when we talk about MANA's assets, I have two questions. One, well, you probably are thinking, what are they? I'm also thinking, where are they? And whether or not they were transferred legally according to, as I said, IRS tax codes. One, and the biggest one that concerns me, and I do believe this belongs to the entire community, and I'll remind us that it's not just, even though it's US centric, the MANA Statistics Project database is actually an international database, one of the largest in the world, of collections of physiologic birth, and in particular out of hospital midwifery data. So it's huge. Data is incredibly valuable, and I have not seen anything that assures me who's managing it, because it had to have been transferred to a nonprofit with a similar mission, with people who can manage it. And by managing it, the next question comes is who's funding it, because it takes funding. There's database developers that maintain the database, and there would be ways, actually, we worked on our vision of it, there would be ways for the database to become somewhat self-sustaining financially, but that's something that would have to be developed. And not by charging people to contribute, that would always be free. And then the other question I would have is, how was it transferred to this new group of managers, as well as now, what is the process for both contributors and researchers to access their own accounts as well as the overall data? I don't know if anybody has any questions about the MANAstats history, if that's come up at all. But I do, in the work I did with the TAs, as they, if you haven't read the blog, I want people to understand that as amazing as the original software was, it was never capable of doing annual reports or doing research that didn't require huge amounts of energy by the researcher, because it was a young program, it was young software, it was amazing for its time. And now what would have taken hours of volunteers in the old database can be done with the push of a button in the new software. And researchers then are much more able to, if it's done right, would be much more able to access the data for a number of different ways. And contributors, there would be ways to do annual reports along with individual statistics. I know that was worked into the original vision, that could really be quite valuable for people's individual practices. So that's an asset that belongs to the community, and there are and I have many questions around it. A much smaller issue would be conference merchandise that the organization owned, belief shirts, silver jewelry. There was a number of totes of things that needed to be donated to a organization of like mission for raising funds or whatever that organization wanted to do with it. Another asset that I have questions around would be the FAM accounting. Deanne perhaps can talk about this in a moment. How we're different. Okay. Oh, you can read that to me here in a minute. With the FAM monies, I want to believe that everybody has good intention. And if they do, then what we would be able to see would be transparent accounting of those monies that were frozen up to date at the time of the dissolution of MANA. And we would see, I was told by on social media by one of the last MANA board members that a new FAM board had been appointed. So I would expect to see some public announcement of who they were and you know, their bios. And then I would expect to see what now the process is for projects to apply for grants. That seems like basic information that the public would need. And then at the end of the dissolution of MANA, all the minutes should have been kept. All of the documentation of everything, including the resolution against me, should have been kept and sent to the archives at Smith College, along with everything else that's been there since the beginning of the organization. So I don't know if Deanne wanted to talk about FAM or where any of that stands, but that's basically the assets as I know them.
Thank you, Sarita. Let's see, we have a question. All right, so, people are asking, I'll put a link to the blog into the chat. So just give me a moment to get to that. First, I'm going to read this question from Deb. From your experience, Sarita, in MANA, how was differences of opinions or decision-making handled? And what can we learn from this to help hear all voices in the future? And you're muted, so you'll have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. It really depended on who the leaders were. It really depended on who the president was and who was in leadership. Because there are different leadership styles, right? And there are different comfort levels with how much control somebody needs. And that's really a key. When you know, like we like to think that all of the decisions were made by consensus, but without true consensus training, I understand that the really consensus is about when you have a conflict, right? That's really what consensus is supposed to be about. Most of the time, everybody can agree on things, what we're going to have for dinner, whatever it is, you know, what our next project's going to be, and we could brainstorm and come up and agree. Consensus is really used when we have some difference of opinion, like I'll give you an example. When it wasn't used and it caused board breakdown would have been, and you can imagine, there was a conference where as a pre-conference workshop, an offering on abortion was offered, and it caused a good bit of pandemonium. There had been a lot of people involved in making that decision as part of a conference, the planning committee. And when the hubbub happened and the negativity happened, the decision to cut that was ultimately made by one person. That was the type of leadership that person provided. Other people, when there was a decision to be made that caused more conflict, brought in somebody to help us with consensus to try to come up with a proposal that everybody could come up with, like whether or not what our position paper on abortion was going to be. So same topic approached in very different ways. And that's why I'm saying that really what needs to happen if there's going to be any sustainable future movement is some agreement that if you're going to do consensus, everybody's going to understand what that means, that we're going to have some leadership training as you go into it, and we're going to understand that that we have to support each other through that, and that if you don't, like, I've taught what's called the Advanced Life Support and Obstetrics course, and I've watched it change through the years. And it's really based on being an expert team. And there's a saying in there that a team of experts does not make an expert team. Like, you have to know how to be a team player and how to work together. And what I would say about MANA is that a team of leaders did not necessarily make a healthy leadership team. And there's got to be a way, and I don't have all the answers. I can tell you what didn't work. There's got to be ways for moving forward such that we can move away from traumatizing each other and move away from things happening to people like what happened to me, right? Like, I was listening to a blog in my own recovery after that. And if anybody knows who said this, I don't remember the gentleman's name. It was on a podcast. And he talked about when things like this happen, online social media, defamation campaigns, attacks, bullying, because I got private messages, I got emails. I mean, like, it wasn't just the petition, right? The petition was the easy part, because that was mostly people that didn't know me. It was the betrayal by people who I had supported and helped for many years that was the hard part, right? And that trauma, what this guy called it, was spiritual murder. And what I can say happened to me was an attempted spiritual murder, because it makes you question your very existence. It takes you to the pit of who you are. And personally, I had the resilience and the support system, people like Deb, people I'm now good friends with, to help me rise from that. Like, I was taught as a child how to rise from that. But I can tell you what it does to you, and you can hear it in my voice, because it takes you to the pit of questioning your very existence. And we've got to stop doing that to each other. That's not okay. It's not okay. As long as we're doing that, guess who loses? The mothers and babies, the families. It's not about the midwives anymore. It's about the people dying. So I'll just take a moment and breathe. Thank you.
I think I'd like to share a little bit with that. And thank you, Sarita, for your bravery, honestly. For those of you who don't know, the history, Sarita has generously put together a blog, which Lisa just posted and Javon requested, that kind of goes through the details of what happened and what she learned from that. And I think that this is the real reason we needed to call this meeting, is because the trauma of that. And for, I know that was hard for you to feel it again, to just experience that again. It's really hard to be there for that. It was, I was so embarrassed to be a part of an organization that would allow something like that to happen to another person publicly. It was so traumatic. And I think that it needs to be addressed in relation to the future of midwifery organizations, how we can avoid repeating that kind of behavior. And so anyway, I just wanted to kind of put a period on that and give you a moment. And
Okay. Okay. My voice is back. So
where are we at, Lisa? I just want to give a little time check. We're like a little over halfway through our hour, and
about 3/4.
yeah, I think
Yeah,
it
we
might
have
be.
15 minutes about to go. So
And
So
how are we on our
wrap up.
agenda?
Yeah, I want to wrap up what I want to say real
Yeah,
quick, and then I
okay.
want to move, if you guys are okay, I want to move into asking people about what voids and next steps they think are important. What helped me come out of that trauma and heal was, I always say my superpower is disassociation. So eventually, once the wounds were, the blood was cleaned up and the wounds were licked and bandaged, I could really begin to pull my own personal self out of it and look at what was being done to me as people's trauma responses. And trauma, their personal trauma responses, but also the trauma of the midwifery community at large, right? And the way we have carried what an author I follow named Bethany Webster calls the mother wound, which she says, I'll quote, exists because there's no safe place to process our rage, and that daughters fear rejection if they question it. And I was definitely, rejected by questioning anything. When I saw Bethany's list of dysfunctional coping mechanisms many years ago, I began to understand some of the behaviors that I wasn't raised to participate in that confused me when I got out into the world. I mean, some of them I was like perfectionism, right? Like we all strive for perfectionism. But the ones that I couldn't understand were self-sabotage, avoiding conflict, not rocking the boat, trying to keep the peace. I was never taught to do that. And the one that she's identified that I think fits in here with the trauma, and we can take these all the way back to, community witch trials, where within that dysfunctional coping mechanism of trying to keep yourself safe by creating some illusion of safety, you have a high tolerance for the poor treatment of others. And so for me, moving forward, I truly believe that the midwifery community has to do trauma work, both as an obligation to being a midwife, to do your own trauma work and see your own trauma patterns. I've certainly done plenty of mine and will continue to do so. But also to look at the trauma we've perpetuated as a community, whether it be the fact that we just all agree to stop throwing each other into the fire, that we agree to stop kicking each other, and be able to, with the agreement that we've been doing that, let's stop hiding it. We've been doing that, and we can't move forward until we admit that. So let's admit it, let's stop it, and let's move forward in some kind of collaborative effort that prioritizes birth autonomy and prioritizes birth as a human right and prioritizes the families that we serve rather than the state that wants to control us. Oh, that was good. I'll leave on that.
Well, well said. So I'm going to move the conversation, just because we have about 10 minutes left, into identifying the voids now that MANA's gone through its cycle, and what's next needed for the birthing community, for because I look at that. And I asked that question, asking for, as a vocation, for people who serve it as a vocation, for people who are served for birthing. I'm doing some logistics in the background as well. There are still people coming in, so to listen to the conversation. So, and I'm going to also remind people that the chat is open, so to share some thoughts, ideas, some feedback in the last couple minutes we have here together. It's back to you, Sarita, and you need to unmute.
I was just putting Bethany Webster's website in the chat as well. So, I've been watching conversations on social media, especially amongst younger midwives, and by that I don't mean age, I mean, new to the profession. And there's definitely some sense of loss. I saw that online. Somebody was telling me about, the midwives in other countries in North America. As I said, even though MANA has been very US centric, there are other people represented, especially in the statistics database. And while they had no clue whether MANA spoke for them or not, or, what anything was beyond the image, they definitely feel they definitely feel a sense of loss. So we know that there's a void that's not necessarily filled by professional organizations centered around credentials. I'm retired. My question to the community is, what do they feel they need? What is it that can't already be filled by the organizations that already exist? And what kind of things do they want to have happen? Sorry, somebody just came up. Right with you, I'm on a Zoom. Sorry.
Yep. We have a question.
Somebody asked.
I'm going to read.
Yeah, somebody. I'm
going to read it out loud.
Kind of catching some of it.
And so Abby, right. I apologize if I don't say this right. Reichard, thank you for Sarita for your vulnerability and sharing. This may be answered soon, but is there still value in reporting MANA stats? So our Florida home birth practice stopped doing them a couple of years back after word came that they were being halted. I wasn't aware of why or the underpinnings, but would be glad to send stats somewhere so that potential research stays current and available. And I think that's a big question. This question of data is so important because this is such a specialized data set.
Yes. Oh, very specialized. It's incredibly valuable. And the people, the website developer, not the developers that I worked with in transitioning to the new database a couple years ago are amazing people who were so excited to do this project and really began to educate themselves on midwifery, and were particularly excited because it could be used in lower resourced countries or by traditional midwives, and questions could be asked to really show not just that midwifery was valuable, but that birth was safe, right? Like it's a whole, there's so much potential in this new database that was developed, and hours were put into that. It has so much potential. I just keep saying that because I saw it. So is it still valuable in reporting and using MANA stats? 100%, as long as it is being transferred in a way that will allow continued development and continued access. And we're going to have to depend on the last people that were the MANA board to be transparent and tell us and give us the information, or the people that they're saying that they've given the database to or set up to manage it. Who are they? And we need transparency. I have no idea how to answer your question otherwise.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. Deanne, are you wanting to share any words of wisdom or thoughts, reflections? You're muted. I'm going to pin you so everyone can see you speak.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, I made the comment that I met Sarita, I guess, back in 2017. I started doing, for my book on Virginia midwifery, interviews trying to understand MANA, the midwife that served and taught me. Cynthia Cayley had not been a fan because she was community-based, indigenous, and centered families. So I was trying to learn, and that's when I started finding out that it was being driven by a small group, and that they were trying to change the culture back to the grassroots and back to community selected midwives over credentials. And you really saw that once Sarita became the president. So when I was asked to be on the community board for the upgrading of MANA stats, and then asked to be on the FAM board, and we were told there may be irregularities, of which we did find. I'm really overwhelmed and I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed that something I've given over 25 years of my life to, seems like a lost profession. And I want to know, what are we going to do about it? As for FAM, that small group of people have taken $78,000 of community money that was supposed to go towards advancing midwifery. And to this day, we don't know where it is. It appears that the FAM started to fund MANA functions, Meek and NARM and some other things to get up off the ground. And it eventually just became a pet bank account for others for their own use. And the board before I was on in 2020 was trying to turn that around. And we tried. And that's when they attempted to remove us, which they never did, following, as Sarita said, the bylaws are there. And you have to follow them. I don't always like them. I've got a anarchy streak. And you still have to follow them. So I hope that I hate using this term, the old timers who seem to have euphoric recall will see that much damage has been done to midwifery, and this is not going to go away. And naming is not shaming. I know I'm going to get a little recovery here. And to heal, you've got to feel. And that starts with honest conversations that are pretty yucky. But if we don't do them, it's just, midwifery has become out of hospital obstetrics. Families are so down the line for what matters. And that's what my last years are. That's what my book is going to eventually is. We've got to do this for the next generations. I only have one grandchild. I'll probably have at least 3 more. I want better for my daughter. And history has always shown that when a modality goes for mainstream medical acceptance, they lose what makes them unique. And it didn't take long in midwifery. That's all I got. Thanks. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Sarita
Thanks.
and Deb.
Thanks, Deanne.
Thank you, Deanne. I just have a
Absolutely.
closing word myself. I just like to say that I want to thank everybody for being here, for opening your ears and for listening. I'd like all of you to share this material with your community, with your group. Yes, think global, act local, talk about it, because we lost a great thing when we lost the dream of MANA. I think we had started losing it years ago. I could trace it back to when we lost connection with the grassroots, when representation from the grassroots and the voice of what was going on. Not all of us who are practicing midwives can take off and go to a region or a conference. Most of us can't do that. And that was where the regional representation really helped out, because we were able to know what was going on the national level and send back what was happening for us. And what's going on with the ICM, and most of you guys know what the ICM is. There's a lot of internal problem there too. Just talk to Robin Lim about it if you want more insight. It's organizing, I've always said, organizing midwives is like organizing feral cats. We don't like to be touched. And we're, it's gotta be real gentle about it, but we're only as strong as we are together. And we've got to figure out a way to get along with one another and to be able to be supportive of one another. And what happened to Sarita should never happen to another midwife ever. And I just, from my bottom of my heart, I pray for healing there. Hi, Gail. I know you want to talk. I think the way that we've decided to handle this is to move, or Lisa, I'm going to call on you now at this point. I'm happy to stay on for another hour with people and let them, we can chat. I'm happy to do that. If we need to close this part though, for recording purposes, I think we do need to do that. So anyway, I leave it to you, Lisa.
Yes, I can open up the conversation. Does someone want to? I think we can do 5 more minutes. I do have to have an appointment that I have to show up for. So I can be here for another couple minutes. Gail, do you want to be recorded? I can see you. You can nod. This is Gail Johnson.
I don't care whether I'm recorded or not, but I would like
Okay.
to get it a little bit longer about this, and because I do have what I think 40 years of input.
Certainly. Okay, so we'll continue on for those who want to stay and listen. For those of you that need to go ahead. And Deb, can you say again where where the recording is going to be posted, and that there will be an opportunity for people to send in emails. There'll be an email address available for people to continue the conversation. So this isn't the end, this is a beginning. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Actually, as I'm thinking about protocol, I think we should close this meeting. I'm
Okay.
happy to open another Zoom meeting right after this. I'll open it. I'll post the link over there in What Happened to Manna. And anybody who wants to come back and talk for a while, I can set aside another hour for chatting and talking, so we can do it right now. I know Sarita had actually mentioned that she wanted to do something like that. So we're happy to do that. We'll make ourselves available. But I think for the sake of the people who really wanted to get this on a recording, we'll close this meeting now, and then I'll send a new Zoom link over to the What Happened to Manna page, and you guys can join us right after this meeting.
Okay, and someone just noticed that Gail stepped away, so I'm not sure if she heard that there's going to be a new Zoom link opening. So
I'll
let's go
PM
ahead
her
and
privately
stop the
too.
recording.
I know
Yep.
Gail will. I'll PM her.
Thank you, everyone, for being here and with your curiosity and compassion, and we'll see what happens and develops moving forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Lisa, for your
Sarita.
expert facilitating.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Lisa, Deb, and everybody that showed up.
Thanks, Deanne. Thanks, all you guys.
Thank you.
You're muted.
I'll get this recording out as soon as possible.